Right, morning and afternoon, everyone. Rob and I would like to welcome you all to today's meeting. The Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project, the SAFE project, is one of the largest and most productive ecological experiments in the tropics. SAFE was established in 2010 through a collaboration between Imperial College, SERP, and the Sabah Foundation, with core funding from Malaysia's Sime Darby Foundation. And this meeting is really to mark the project's 10th anniversary. For the past decade, many hundreds of scientists have worked at SAFE from dozens of the world's leading universities. And over the next couple of hours, we'll hear from some of these scientists and about the impacts that the SAFE science has achieved, not just in terms of conservation and sustainable agriculture, but in supporting early career scientists. Before we move on to the meeting proper, I would just like to thank the Sime Darby Foundation in particular for partnering with us and providing such generous long-term funding. This has not only paid for the collection of core data sets, but also a research infrastructure and team of field staff that has enabled us to attract a whole array of independently funded science and research projects supported by grants totaling millions of pounds. I would also like just to thank our fantastic team of research assistants and staff on the project, without whom very little of the science would have been possible. Our MC for today is Peng Heon, who's a key member of this team. Sui has led the vertebrate monitoring program at SAFE for many years now, and is the project's recently appointed science coordinator. So I'm going to hand over to Sui to run through the agenda and to give us some instructions for the meeting, and then I'll be back to introduce the first three speakers. So over to you, Sui.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for the introduction. So just to run through the agenda we have for today, the first item on our agenda today is a webinar. We have lined up a fantastic series of talks to showcase our scientific achievements, our impacts on policy, and our involvement in training and development. At the end of each talk, for participants, we have a 5-minute Q&A session. So you can choose to ask a question by speaking up, by raising your hand, indicating on the reaction tab, as you can see on the Zoom, or you can type a question in the Q&A box and I will read it out. So we'll try to get all your questions answered if time permits. After the webinar, the next item on our agenda is a breakout group meeting. So the breakout group meeting gives you an opportunity as a participant to engage in in-depth discussions, exchange ideas, develop plans, or ask questions to our panel of experts. So we have specific topics lined up for the breakout groups. It will be hydrology, biodiversity, disease ecology, carbon, skills gaps, conservation, and forest restoration. So that would happen after the webinar. And so to join that breakout group session after the webinar, you would need to sign out of this webinar Zoom and then click on the Zoom breakout group meeting link that you can find in your invite email. So don't worry if you've not decided yet which breakout group you want to join later on. You can always move between these breakout groups if you have the updated version of Zoom on your phone, on your device. But I will repeat these instructions later again at the end of our first session of webinar. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it back to Glenn to introduce our first three speakers. Enjoy.
Great, thank you, Sui. So speaking first, we have Mabath Chandran. Mr. Chandran is a 50-year veteran of the plantation and commodity sector. After graduating from the University of Adelaide in agricultural economics, Mr. Chandran held senior positions in the Franco-Belgian company Socfin for many years, was the founding chief executive of the Malaysian Palm Oil Association, and was one of the key people behind the formation of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO. Mr. Chandran has received numerous awards in recognition of his contribution to sustainable agriculture. And we're greatly honoured to have you speaking to us today, Mr. Chandran. Secondly, we have Caroline Russell, who will speak about the Sime Darby Foundation and the programs it supports in Malaysia, of which SAFE is just one. Aside from her role as a member of the Foundation's council, on which she has a particular responsibility for its environment stream, Caroline is the Chief Executive Officer of Bow Plantations, a family business with a 90-year history of producing tea in Malaysia, and I think is actually Malaysia's largest tea producer. Caroline also sits on a number of foundation, charitable and corporate boards, and like me is presently stuck in the UK thanks to COVID. So we're very grateful that you're able to join us today, Caroline. And then finally, in this first part of the meeting, we have Professor Sir Charles Godfray, who chairs SAFE's Science Advisory Committee. Charles is one of the UK's leading ecologists, and he actually started his career in Malaysia, in some respects, studying the insect pests of oil palm plantation. Charles is the director of the Charles is the director of the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford, has advised the UK government in a number of important policy areas, including food security, and chairs the DEFRA Science Advisory Council, DEFRA being the UK's Environment and Agriculture Board. For his sins, Charles was also my boss for 10 years as chair of SERP's board. And again, we're very grateful that you're able to find time to join us today, Charles. Swee, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, for the introduction. So without further ado, can we welcome Mr. M.R. Chandran to deliver, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings to all participants from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. My thanks to Glen for your kind invitation to say a few words from the oil palm industry perspective at the SAFE 2020 conference. I have narrowed down the topic to why sustainability matters for the plantation business. At the outset, let me emphasize that oil palm is a perennial crop with an economic lifespan of more than 25 years. It is extraordinarily productive with a smaller land footprint than any other edible oil crop. Globally, oil palm accounts for an annual production of 85 million tons of crude palm and palm kernel oil from about 23 million hectares. In contrast, soybean and rapeseed, the second and third largest vegetable oil crops, together only produce a combined 84 million tons of oil, yet occupy more than 163 million hectares of land. Now that is a 7-fold increase over oil palm. The global palm oil industry is a springboard for economic growth, contributing to alleviation of rural poverty and also ensuring food security for the planet's growing population. It has catalyzed the development of the oleochemical sector, providing a cost-effective and sustainable supply of detergents and cleaning products used in households and healthcare. Do note that palm oil accounts for 40% of total traded vegetable oils in the world. Despite its overwhelming positive attributes, oil palm has been singled out as the cause of deforestation and biodiversity loss, especially by the EU and the United States, ignoring the fact that beef production and soy cultivation are the largest agricultural drivers of deforestation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are living in times where headlines determine and sway the sentiments of the discussion rather than what science, substance, and experience can offer. Seeking boycotts of palm oil products is not the answer, as no other oil crop can match its productivity. The answer lies in transparent and effective certification schemes right across the entire value chain of the industry. to provide assurance that palm oil is produced in a sustainable and socially responsible manner. I am happy to state commendable progress on sustainability has been achieved over the last 16 years since the establishment of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, or RSPO, in 2004. Today, certified production volume stands at 19% of global supply. RSPO's vision is to transform markets to make sustainable palm oil the norm. However, until such time it becomes the norm, it is important for consumers, businesses, and global stakeholders alike to understand that there are different ways that palm oil can be produced. May I emphasize that this scheme also includes the 4 to 5 million smallholders who make their living from the crop, despite the diversity of challenges and situations faced by small farmers globally. I would reiterate that the oil palm industry cannot afford to be complacent. It is heartening that the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil, or MSPO, and National Certification Scheme launched in 2015 to bring on board all players, including organized and independent smallholders, to embrace sustainable practices was made mandatory by the Malaysian government this year. The industry cannot be guilty of greenwashing and must ensure that ESG principles are strictly enforced. It will always be subject to scrutiny and criticisms because of its international profile. Ultimately, it will be the stakeholders in the sector who will play the central role in driving the changes to policies and processes that will be required as the palm oil sector starts its course into a volatile future. In conclusion, may I, on behalf of the Malaysian oil palm industry, extend my appreciation to the entire team involved in the SAFE project, which I understand is one of the largest ecological experiments in the world, and also extend my congratulations on your 10th anniversary, which I reckon is a remarkable accomplishment. Thank you, and wish you all a productive conference. Over to you, Peng.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chandran. It was a very, very interesting and inspiring talk as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, now it's our pleasure now to welcome our next speaker, Ms. Caroline Russell. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Sue Peng, and a very good afternoon to everybody in Malaysia, and indeed morning to those joining from the UK like myself. I'm really thoroughly delighted to be joining this online Zoom webinar about the 10th anniversary of this incredible project. We hadn't originally envisaged that we would be doing this online. I think we thought that we'd be all meeting in Sabah when we originally envisaged having a conference. And I'm really thoroughly delighted that despite the travel restrictions, despite the difficulties arising this year from the pandemic, we have still been able to have this conference, which is the culmination of 10 years of work. And if I might, I'll take a few moments to tell you a little bit about Yayasan Sime Darby. The foundation of Sime Darby has been a proud sponsor of the SAFE project and was one of its first funders and supporters, with a commitment of 30 million ringgit from 2010 to 2020. The collaboration with the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, or SERP, in close collaboration with Imperial College London and key local organizations in Malaysia, is the Foundation's largest project commitment so far. And that was since our inception in 1982. The Sime Darby Foundation is the philanthropic arm of Sime Darby Berhad, Sime Darby Plantation Berhad, and Sime Darby Property Berhad. We focus on leading to make a sustainable impact and a difference in the lives of others under our 5 pillars of education, community and health, environment, sports, as well as arts and culture. Under our environment pillar, we're dedicated to protecting and preserving the environment and conserving biodiversity both in land and in the sea. One of the ways that we achieve this is by supporting world-class scientific research, such as that in the SAFE project, with the aim of disseminating as well as translating those research results into impactful action with on-ground initiatives, and developing highly capable researchers and custodians working towards advocacy and policy changes. We've been very proud of SAFE scientific findings, and these have assisted the plantation industry and government agencies in facilitating conservation-focused improvements in the oil palm plantations through myriad of published data sets and extensive articles. The dedicated website, www.safeproject.net, SAFE's research findings are also available to industry players through the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, or the RSPO, which Mr. Chandran has mentioned. These have contributed directly to the development of oil palm growers' in-house operating procedures, particularly in managing forest patches and riparian reserves embedded within plantations. In addition, the SAFE project science has also assisted in developing high carbon stocks approach in mapping conservation areas within new palm oil plantations. Since 2016, the SAFE project has also collaborated with Sabah's Department of Irrigation and Drainage and its Environmental Protection Department to improve regulations on riparian buffer design. And meanwhile, the findings on biodiversity value of log forests has contributed significantly in the redrafting of Malaysia's obligations under the Convention of Biological Diversity. In terms of capacity building, in total to date, 49 PhD students, 4 postdocs, and 60 master's students were trained under SAFE, under which 11 were provided direct scholarship by the Sime Darby Foundation. Our funding has also supported almost 80% of the total of the SAFE project's field staff and the project's associated cost. They covered about 30 Malaysian research assistants and technical staff at its peak. In addition, 144 Malaysian researchers and students were employed and trained under the SAFE project. Of course, there have been a few challenges along the way. One would expect that in a project of this magnitude, but we're extremely proud of the achievements that have been made over this last 10 years. The Sime Darby Foundation would like to extend our utmost appreciation to the SAFE project team under SERP, Imperial College London, Yayasan Sabah, Benta Wawasan, and the Sabah Forestry Department for their efforts and contributions to the SAFE project, which has provided a unique opportunity to enhance the understanding of the impact of forest conversions onto the ecosystem. These insights become sound scientific basis for the on-ground management of forests within plantations and the implementation of improved strategies and operating procedures. At Yayasan Sime Darby, we hope that the data from SAFE can be used continuously to make active land use decisions, not just here in Southeast Asia, but around the world, to best design such mixed landscapes in the future with minimized environmental impact. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Caroline. That was a very supportive talk. Thank you very much. And now I'll call upon, I'm delighted to call upon Professor Charles Godfray. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sri. It's an enormous pleasure to be here talking to the 10th anniversary SAFE meeting. It's a personal pleasure because, as Glen said, I've been involved in working in Malaysia since I was in my 20s. And in particular for 2 decades now, I've been involved in Malaysian Anglo research collaborations in Sabah, first at SERP and then more recently with the SAFE project. So there's been this long history of collaboration between the United Kingdom and Malaysia in canopy research and forest research. And it's wonderful to see it continuing today in many ways, but in particular in SAFE, which we're here to discuss today. When Mr. Chandran was talking about the plantation business and that this is a long-term affair, oil palm is a perennial crop, then it made me think that there are some similarities with scientific research, and especially in ecological research. And there is somewhat of an irony that some of the most urgent challenges that we're facing today, humanity is facing today in the environmental area, requires long-term research. And it requires research that exactly in building a plantation needs investment and tendering over a long period of time. And this is difficult research to support and fund in a science funding environment, which quite often and typically privileges short-term returns on investment. And so one of the important things about SAFE is that this is a project that has gone on for a long time, that has invested from the start, and is now, and I firmly believe in the future, will be yielding tremendous scientific harvest. And it's interesting, if one looks at the publications that have come out of SAFE and the scientific insights, then they've been happening right from the start, but as time has gone on, these have built up and have become particularly impressive. And over the conference, we're going to hear lots about exactly what the scientific outputs are. And I'm not going to go through them, but certainly the things that have excited me are real insights into carbon dynamics. We just really have to understand carbon dynamics if we have any hope of achieving net zero, if we have any hope of keeping the world within 1.5 and 2 degrees. And this is important in tropical rainforests throughout the world, but it's particularly important in Southeast Asia. The dipterocarp forests you get in Southeast Asia are not the same as the forests you get, for example, in South America. So it's important regionally, it's important globally. And one of the particular interests with SAFE, looking at the interaction between natural environment and the farmed environment, the plantation environment, is to see how the two interact. I particularly like some of the work that's come out recently, what might be called the acoustic topography of the rainforest. We as scientists have some fabulous new instrumentation that we can apply to answer questions about nature. And it is really exciting to see that being deployed in the SAFE sites, and deployed in the SAFE sites first before they've been deployed anywhere else. I think we're going to hear today a little bit about the resilience of the rainforest to challenges. Again, one of the advantages one has with long-term research is that one has a time series of data so that one can see how the forest reacts when one has an El Nino or other great challenge or other challenge like that. And with my background in insects, it's really interesting to see the research that has showed how important understanding the termites are in understanding how the forest reacts to these challenges. And we're all to different degrees affected by the pandemic that we're going through at the moment. And the research, which I have to say, as on the Science Advisory Board right at the beginning, I thought was going to be rather peripheral and looking at some of the zoonotic diseases, suddenly has become absolutely center stage. We need to understand the biology of the animals that may host viruses that may jump to us. So let me finish by congratulating Rob, Swee, Glen and the team on what SAFE has accomplished over the last 10 years. And to thank Yayasan, Sime Darby and all the other Malaysian foundations, and referred to Yayasan Sabah, Bento Wawasan, all the other Malaysian organizations who have supported the project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Charles. Okay, so thank you for the talk. Okay, so next, moving on, I'd like to introduce our next speaker for this session, Dr. Eleanor Slade. She's an assistant professor at the NTU, the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. She has more than 17 years of experience working in tropical rainforest and plantation landscapes. She also leads a collaboration with the Sabah State Government, Department of Irrigation and Drainage to update guidelines on the management of riparian reserves. Today, she's going to be talking to us about biodiversity in oil palm. How can we retain it? Okay, over to you, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sui. Sorry, I couldn't find out how to unmute myself. Let's try again. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. So good morning, and in Malaysia, Salamat Petang. So as Sui said, I'm an assistant professor at the Asian School of the Environment at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And I've been working in Sabah since 2003. I did my PhD in Sabah, and I've been working at the SAFE project since it started in 2011. So I can't believe it's 10 years that we're celebrating this year. So from 2015 to 2019, I was the project coordinator for the Lombok project, which was a big consortium project that ran out of SAFE and focused on the impacts of riparian reserves for conserving biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So I've been tasked today with the rather onerous job of summarising the immense amount of work that's been conducted on biodiversity within the SAFE landscape in just 10 minutes. So it's impossible to mention all the great research that has been done over the past 10 years. So I'm just going to present a few studies as examples of what we've learned in terms of how biodiversity fares in oil palm dominated landscapes, and some positive ways in which oil palm landscapes can be made more friendly for biodiversity. And I want to start by thanking all of the researchers whose research I'll be presenting, and to everybody who sent me slides and figures to use in this talk. I hope that I do it justice, and if anyone has any questions, then please do get in contact with the authors of this study. So what do we know about biodiversity in oil palm landscapes? So this graph contains the data collected on vertebrate and invertebrate groups across the SAFE landscape in the last 10 years. And what it does is it compares how many species we've seen in oil palm to how many species occur in forests. And what we can see is for all these different groups, we see that it's always negative. And this means that there's always fewer species in oil palm plantations compared to in forests. So for every animal group we've looked at, it suffered to some degree within the oil palm plantations. However, some species do quite well within oil palm plantations. So, for example, the domestic dogs are the real winners within these plantations. So they don't decline in abundance. In fact, they're often increasing in abundance. They're often increasing in abundance. And some of the native animal groups that we have, so things like the Malay civet or the leopard cats, are also managing to stay around with populations that are largely the same in oil palm plantations as they are within the forest. And so these tend to be the generalist predators or scavengers. And then we've got some species like the bearded pigs, for example, that have managed to adapt to using oil palm plantations. And so in the primary forest, they tend to be active during the daytime. So this is some work by Charlie Davison. And they don't often, you don't often see them in primary forest active during the night. However, bearded pigs are hunted, so they don't really like people, and there's lots and lots of people within oil palm plantations, but there's also lots of fruit in oil palm plantations, and the pigs really like the fruit. This is a great supplement for their diet. So what they've done is they've got around this challenge of wanting to go into oil palm plantations, but not liking people by changing their behavior. So what Charlie found is that if you look at the activity of pigs within oil palm plantations, actually they're not very active during the middle of the day when the oil palm workers are around, but during the evenings and the nighttime, they become more active. So these group of animals have managed to adapt to oil palm plantations and adapt to being able to use the oil palm plantation as a habitat. But for the other remaining 50 or so species of mammals that researchers at SAFE have looked at, the story isn't so good. So what we can see is that for a lot of the mammals, actually things like the quite charismatic animals and threatened species like the Sunda pangolin or the orangutans, that they actually decrease within oil palm plantations. And if they are there, then they're there in very, very small numbers. So they're not living within the oil palm plantations or breeding in the oil palm plantations, but perhaps what they're doing is passing through the oil palm plantations. So for example, going through the oil palm plantations, crossing it to get from one forest habitat to another. A few of these species, for example, the orangutans as well, use the oil palm plantations as a source of extra food as well. So they might go into the plantation to get a bit of extra resource, but they're clearly not using oil palms as a habitat in terms of the conservation sense. And so one of the reasons for this, of course, is because oil palm plantations are very hot environments. So this is some work by Stephen Hardwick. And what he showed is that at midday, the temperature in an oil palm plantation is typically about 6 degrees hotter than it is within a forest. And the ground surface temperatures can go up into the 40 or 50 degree range. So this is a really powerful localized form of climate change. So forget about the 2-degree rises globally that we've been talking about. Deforestation and conversion to oil palm introduces this 6 degrees rise in temperature, and it does it almost instantaneously when the forest is cut down and converted. And so this doesn't give animals and plants a lot of time to adapt to these new conditions. And we can see in this very nice experiment that was done by Mike Boyle on ants. So here Mike put the ants in a test tube and he heated them up until they fell over. And what this tells you is the maximum temperature that the ants can tolerate. So this is called the CT max that you can see on the y-axis here. And what we can see is this maximum temperature that different ant genera can tolerate here. And it varies quite a lot between the different species and between the different genera. So some species actually fall over and can't tolerate very high temperatures. So by 40 degrees centigrade, they're inactive. Whereas other species can tolerate quite high temperatures up to 48 degrees. And it's these physiological differences in animals and in plant groups that impact their ability to survive within oil palm plantations. So if you can survive these high temperatures, then you'll be able to survive within the plantation. But if you can't tolerate these high temperatures, then you perhaps are going to become extinct within those oil palm landscapes. So what we've seen is that some animals are able to adapt and use oil palm landscapes, and some animals can't use these as habitats, but are able or are passing through them. So what we wanted to ask is, what can we do to help animals survive within these landscapes? And so the next part of my talk, I just want to show a few results from work done by the Lombok Consortium that I worked for from 2015. And their research was really looking at whether these forest patches, or what we call riparian forest buffers, so these are strips of forest that run along the rivers, whether these can help make plantations more biodiversity friendly. So a study led by Nick Deere from DICE at the University of Kent found that high carbon stock forest actually safeguarded quite a lot of forest specialist species. So there's been quite a lot of interest in these high carbon stock forests, and that can include the riparian buffer strips as well. And so these forests do seem to be important, particularly for key species of conservation concern. So things like clouded leopards, binturongs, orangutans, and tufted ground squirrels. And also the larger and more connected these patches are, the more able they are to safeguard vulnerable species. We also looked at these riparian forest strips, so these riparian forests along the rivers. And what we found is that these riparian buffers are also super important forest areas for biodiversity. And Nick Deere and Matt Strubig are analysing a data set from SAFE, from the riparian areas around SAFE, looking at 6 different wildlife groups. And what they're finding is that if you double the width from the 20 metres, which is the legal baseline of buffer width for Sabah, and if you double this to where this dotted line is here at around 40 metres, you can actually support the majority of species that are found within forested areas. So for some groups like frogs or beetles, this might be, you might want to increase this up to say 80 metres, but relatively small increases in buffer width can help conserve a lot of the biodiversity within the oil palm plantation. But what we've also found is that buffer width is not the only thing that influences the biodiversity that's found within these riparian areas. So for example, Dave Seaman and Henry Bernard from UMS did orangutan nest count surveys at SAFE and found evidence of orangutans in all buffers, including those that are right out in the oil palm plantation. So buffer width wasn't necessarily important in predicting orangutan densities, but rather having some forests nearby, and particularly taller canopy forest, was a good predictor of orangutans being detected. Similarly, Kat Mullin and Henry found that buffer width wasn't such an important predictor of bats. So they recorded bats using these acoustic detectors every evening and found that activity was actually really, really high in these riparian strips. Sometimes activity was higher than even in the forest patches around SAFE. So the riparian strips seem to be really important for bats. But again, it's where the forest is higher and you get taller canopy, that this is particularly important. So it's not just the buffer width, it's also the forest quality. Similarly, Annabelle, a UMS master's student, surveyed otters along the rivers, recording their scats and tracks. And she found the 2 main species of otter in Sabah along most of the rivers in SAFE. But she found that scats and signs were more common on the larger rivers, flatter with larger banks, irrespective of the buffer width. And finally, for dung beetles, which is my favourite group, so Joe Williamson has just published a nice paper where he found that dung beetles are negatively impacted both by temperature and moisture, but also by the buffer width. So there's an interaction here between the temperature and the width of the buffer. So what all these studies are showing is that, yes, the width of the buffer is important, and if we can increase this width, this will help conserve biodiversity, but we also need to take into account the quality of these forest patches as well. So just very quickly, I want to finish by showing you some research on whether riparian buffers harbour pest species of oil palm plantations. And this is important, I think, because this is something that the oil palm companies always ask me when we're talking about, okay, we need to increase buffer widths or restore buffers or maintain buffers. So some work by Claudia Gray looked at herbivory rates on oil palm fronds by invertebrates. So things like caterpillars or beetles causing damage to the fronds. And she found that there was no difference in the levels of herbivory at oil palm that had riparian reserves versus oil palm that didn't have riparian reserves nearby. And similarly, there have been a couple of studies now by Nelsie Joseph and Phil Chapman that showed that pest rat populations, yes, they're super high within oil palm plantations, but they're actually very low within riparian reserves. So these pest rats are existing within the oil palm plantations, but they're not coming from the riparian reserves. They're not spilling over into the oil palm plantations. So riparian buffers do not seem to be harbouring herbivore pests or pest rats. So moving forward, what would we like to do now that we have a very strong science evidence base after 10 years of research at SAFE on how biodiversity responds within oil palm dominated landscapes? So we'd like to incorporate a lot of this science into policy and decision making, and that will be covered a little bit in the next talk. We want to use this to inform certification guidelines. So we've contributed to these simplified guidelines on riparian reserves for the RSPO, for example. We want to consider the social, cultural and community values of biodiversity, riparian buffers and forest fragments. And now that we've got such a large science base, we'd also like to use our research to inform restoration of forest patches and riparian buffers within Sabah as well. So thank you very much for listening. Terima kasih. Thanks to all our funders, and yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Eleanor Slade. So just a reminder, if you would like to speak up, please indicate using the reaction tab to raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A box. We will unmute you if you want to speak up and ask your question. Oh, there's someone. Okay, wait, let me get to you. Okay, can we mute Azamuddin Nasir?
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, we can hear you. Yep.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Eleanor. I'm Azamuddin. I'm very happy to listen to your what you presented just now. I just was wondering, you mentioned about biodiversity in your slides. You mentioned about aquatic ecosystems. You said it was coming soon. I didn't see any further explanation to that part of the slide.
Yeah, so we have also surveyed, so Dr. Sarah Luke has done a lot of work on aquatic invertebrates within the SAFE landscape, and there's also been some work done on fish populations as well, but at the moment we're still analysing that data for the meta-analysis, so that group hasn't been presented, so this is still a work in progress for the aquatic invertebrates. That's why it says coming soon. But Sarah's previous studies have shown that that these riparian areas are super important, of course, for aquatic invertebrates. So for things like dragonflies, which larvae rely on the rivers. So they really rely on these riparian areas and good water quality within them.
Okay, we have a question from Sheena James. Can we unmute? Hello. Okay. Hi, Sheena.
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, please proceed with your question.
My profile picture. Pardon me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was actually thinking about the measurement of expansion of orangutans when they disperse. Do they go to the lower canopy and also above the canopy? And then they sort of make a measurement which is very quantitative as well as consistent. I'm just intrigued about it. Can you please explain?
Yeah, so I have to admit, so I'm just summarizing the science that's been done by all these researchers. So if you really want to know more about the orangutans within the SAFE landscape, then please do have a look at the papers or contact Dave Seaman, Matt Strubig and Nick Deer to talk about that. But there are standardized methods for monitoring orangutans. So I think the ones that Dave was using was to do ground-based measurements of the orangutans and sightings of those orangutans. But there has also been work done in Sabah that's looked at at sort of these ground-based measurements and then flown drones over the canopy as well to look for nests of orangutans as well.
Do you really think that we need a second faunal survey?
Sorry?
Based on these approaches? Do you really think that we need a second faunal survey based on these approaches?
A second survey? In what way,
Yeah,
sorry?
I was wondering about, you know, having a second survey, faunal survey by helicopter.
Oh, okay, for the orangutan work, you mean?
Yeah, if
so,
you have the basis, if you have the, I'd say like some kind of information at the lower level, like a baseline or data bench, data line or benchmark.
So I mean, I think that these, as far as I understand, I'm an invertebrate person. As far as I understand, I think these surveys are fairly robust, and I think a lot of the work that's been done on these surveys shows that, of course, both whether you're estimating from the ground or you're estimating from drones from above, that both of them potentially can underestimate to a certain degree. But I think particularly in these kind of habitats, I mean, they're not primary forest habitats, right? So they're riparian areas where the canopy tends to be willow and oil palm plantations. So, sorry? Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. I think you are right. It's really important.
Yeah. But I mean, please do contact the researchers at DICE, so Matt Strubig, and I think Nick is somewhere on this call, so he might be able to.
Nick Brown. Is that a guy, Nick Brown?
Nick Deere and Dave Seaman should be able to answer your questions more.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Off. Roger, off.
Nick Deere is actually going to be joining in the breakout group session, so you can have a more detailed conversation with him there. We have one question here. Are there from Vikram Mauli? Are there any spillover effects from the high carbon stock forests that could help oil palm reserves? Example, pest control from insectivorous.
Yeah, so far most of our research seems to suggest that there isn't very much spillover in either direction, actually. So this is something that we want to look at a little bit more in terms of ecosystem services or disservices, but most of the research so far seems to suggest that you get species that occur in forest strips that are quite specific to forests, and then you get oil palm species, and that there's not a lot of transfer actually between those. But we haven't looked at things, for example, I mean, I don't know, so services within oil palm plantations, such as pest control services, but certainly what Claudia's work was showing was that there didn't seem to be much spillover between the riparian strips and the oil palm plantations. So there doesn't seem to be much ecosystem service, but also not much ecosystem disservice either. But this is definitely an area I think that we want to explore a little bit more. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the last question for Eleanor for this this talk would be from Professor Dr. Imran Ho Abdullah. Please elaborate more on moving forward with regards to the social, cultural, and community values of biodiversity.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, so one of the things we've looked at a lot here, of course, is the science. So we've now got 10 years of quite nice science, for example, on riparian reserves and the importance of biodiversity. And I guess in my the next talk that I'm going to be filling in for Melissa on, we talk about some of those, how we've translated some of that into policy. And when we're talking about expanding, for example, the risks of riparian reserves, so that has huge impacts then in terms of local communities and how they value biodiversity, how they value increases in widths in riparian reserves, whether that's a good thing because it helps them protect waters or fishing, or potentially whether this could be a bad thing because it expands into, for example, their agricultural smallholder plantations. So we'd like to to expand to not me personally, because I'm not a social scientist, but to work with social scientists to look a bit at how they value, for example, riparian reserves, and what they would think about some of our scientific findings. And this is something that we haven't done at all at the moment. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. There are still more questions, but then we have to stick to our schedule. So we just type in your questions at the chat box, and then maybe if Eleanor is free later, she can look back and she can answer you, or you can contact Eleanor separately if you have more questions to ask her. Anyway, thank you for all your questions, participants. Thank you, Dr. Eleanor Slade. Next, we have Ms. Melissa Payne, the Assistant Director of Policy at SERP, Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, based in KK. Unfortunately, Melissa is unwell and she can't join us today. So building on from the previous talk, Eleanor is going to continue talking about this part, linking the science to policy, because Eleanor has been heavily involved in a lot of the policy development work with Melissa at SERP. Okay, thank you. Over to you again.
Okay. Sorry, everybody's got a lot of me today. Can you see the screen? Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Sui. So yeah, Sui said I'm standing in for Melissa today, and there are several examples of science that has been conducted at SAFE that has contributed to policy. But because of the short amount of time that we have today, I'm going to talk about the example I'm most familiar with, which is the co-development of the science on riparian buffers with stakeholders from the Sabah government, and how we've been using this science to help inform policy. So the work that we've been doing on riparian buffers is really quite unusual in that for the past about 4 years, local and international scientists have been working with government agencies led by EPD, so the Environmental Protection Department, and DID, the Department for Irrigation and Drainage. And we've been working in close collaboration to exchange knowledge and develop the evidence base to inform environmental policy on riparian areas in Sabah. So this has been a huge team of people working together. And so this collaboration began in 2016 at the heart of Borneo, when myself and Glen, who's the Senior Assistant Director of DID, were first introduced to each other. And this was really the brainchild of Agnes Agama, who was the Assistant Director of SERP at the time. And she came up with this brilliant idea that rather than the usual conference format of scientists giving talks to other scientists and then decision makers sitting in a room with other decision makers and policy makers talking to each other, she came up with the idea to run a series of workshops where scientists and policy makers were paired together and put together to discuss topics of conservation policy and relevance. And so she paired myself and Glen to co-lead a workshop on riparian buffers and connectivity. And so this collaboration really started with DID, but we've since expanded to include other government agencies. So EPD have been heavily involved, DOA and FRC as well. And when we started to talk with Glen and started to talk with the people in DID, what we discovered is that DID were actually reviewing their riparian guidelines over the next few years. But most of the guidelines were based just on water quantity and water quality considerations. So rather than a strategy that provides, that looks at the full range of benefits of riparian buffers. What Glen said was that there seemed to be little supporting evidence to demonstrate that reserves are effective for other things. So for example, for providing habitat or corridors for terrestrial biodiversity, for ecosystem services or disservices, or for carbon cycling and storage. And so Glen was super excited that actually this was some of the things that we were looking at the SAFE project. And what he really highlighted was that this scientific evidence base that we were collecting was often not very accessible to local decision makers and local policy makers. And so what we tend to do as scientists is do our research and publish those in scientific papers, but we're not sharing this with the wider stakeholder community who would like to use the results that we're finding. So from 2016 to 2017, we had a series of meetings with various stakeholders and various government groups. So this one here is our first meeting with DID, where I think we were 4 scientists and 30 environmental and civil engineers. And what we decided to do was to have 2 outputs in those first few years. So we decided that we would co-develop, so this working with the government agencies to actually co-develop and write both scientific papers, but also science for policy documents as well. So the first thing that we did was a literature review on riparian reserves in tropical agriculture from 1952 to 2007. And this literature review was led by Sarah Luke. And what it really showed was that there was hardly any data on riparian reserves and the benefits of riparian reserves within tropical agriculture. So most of the knowledge that we have comes from temperate regions. And what we also did in this first couple of years is work together with DID and with EPD in translating our science into accessible science for policy briefs and helping to feed this into guidelines. So for example, we came up with this policy brief which summarised some of the science I just talked about in the previous talk, that we could give to oil palm managers, government agencies, and that produces this in very easy to digest ways. And we also contributed to the RSPO guidelines on riparian reserves, simplified guidelines. The other thing that we did that I think was quite unusual is that we gave a series of talks on our policy briefs and the scientific findings and how we'd co-develop this knowledge together. And so Micklin and I talked at the 2007 Heart of Borneo conference. We also went to scientific conferences together. So Micklin came to the ATBC, the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation in Kuching, and we gave joint talks about the work, really showing that we were really working together and that these were outputs from stakeholders really engaging with scientists. So in 2018, we decided that we'd like to take this work a bit further. So we had a wider stakeholder engagement. So we organised a large knowledge sharing get together. We had 73 people attending from government ministries, from civil society, universities, and oil palm companies. So this got quite a lot of press in Sabah. And what we asked people to do was to, in hypothetical situations, to say where they think that riparian reserves are important, how wide riparian reserves might need to be in different contexts within the landscape. And what we tried to do was to use this information to come up with a user-friendly planning tool for decision makers, to provide some sort of standardized guidelines on how wide a riparian reserve might want to be in different situations, and depending, for example, whether you think it's a corridor for wildlife or whether it's important more just for water quality, as an example. So what we wanted to do is present standardized guidelines that draw on existing regulations and existing guidelines within Sabah, but then are underpinned now by this new scientific evidence base that we had. So this was our very rough first decision tree that came out of that workshop, with the sort of yes and no way of looking at it, and then eventually you'll come up with how wide your riparian reserve should be in that situation. And of course, this is always a long process to draw up these sorts of things, and they need to be refined several times. So in 2019, we held more stakeholder workshops where we looked at this tree, and of course, there was lots of sort of discussion about what this tree should look like if you're in an oil palm plantation versus if you're near a forest reserve, for example. And so this is an ongoing process. We've been a little bit held back by the COVID situation in that we can't get together anymore, but we're working on finalising this tree. And we've been super lucky that we managed to secure some funding from the British Council and the Mite Foundation to work on this decision tree. So we've now named ourselves the Rye Tree. And this has given us some money to really work on decision support tools for effective riparian protection and management within Sabah. So we've now got a technical committee which is made up of various government departments, NGOs and scientists and universities, which is working on finalising this tree. And so the aims of this work, of this translation of science into policy, are to conduct analyses to identify the rivers that are important for biodiversity within Sabah and to confirm the optimum of sizes of riparian buffers in different contexts. And so this is something where we have a lot of the data for this now, as you can see from my previous talk, but we're still working on the optimization of the analysis. We're working towards finalising the riparian decision tree itself, which will hopefully help to guide these decisions on protected riparian zones. The next stage is to build capacity to implement the tree and to provide dedicated training materials and training workshops on riparian areas, and to help advise government partners and wider stakeholders with science briefs. So to work on translating science that's coming out of Sabah on riparian areas and on HCS areas to help streamline guidelines that we have. And finally, we hope that we can share our findings nationally, so within Malaysia as well. So if, for example, within Peninsular Malaysia, to help promote more streamlined riparian policies across different policy contexts. And as I mentioned in my last talk, we now have this big body of scientific evidence on how biodiversity responds within the oil palm landscapes and particularly within riparian landscapes. And one of the big things that we're looking at now, of course, is restoring these landscapes. So restoring them, maintaining them, potentially expanding them. And so can we use this science now to help inform how best to restore the landscape, restore these riparian buffer strips? So with that, I'd just like to thank you all for listening again. As I said, this is a huge project, many people involved in it. And of course to Melissa, who sadly couldn't be here today, but has been a real driving force behind this collaboration over the past couple of years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor, again for your second talk and stepping in the last minute for filling in for Melissa. Okay, so we have 5 minutes for Q&A. So the first question here, I'll read it out from someone called Miranda using their user Heinz data. Anyway, is there any way to work out how much palm oil a country can develop based on the amount of population, how much prime forest still exists, or other KPIs? I'm in the opinion we should try to limit palm oil cultivation in Malaysia, especially in Borneo, where we still have prime forests.
So this isn't particularly a question about this talk, right? I mean, I think that there are studies that have been looking at the amount of land available for conversion, for example, to palm oil. Certainly within Sabah at the moment, I don't think that this is such an issue, right? Because most of our primary forest within Sabah is protected now. And companies that are signed up, for example, to RSPO certification guidelines have zero deforestation policies. So I think within Sabah now, most of the oil palm areas are not sort of going into primary forest or into these areas. So what we're looking at now is ways within oil palm plantations that we can make these more biodiversity friendly and more friendly to wildlife. I don't know if anybody else here would like Glen or Prof. Chandran would like to comment on this, but or if that.
Yeah, I'm happy just to quickly just back up what you said, Eleanor. I mean, certainly signatories to the RSPO are committed to have zero deforestation commitments in place, as do many companies in plantation supply chains. So for the most part, at least in Malaysia, conversion of pristine forests to oil palm plantation isn't really an issue at present, at least not in the sort of regulated part of the industry. And you know, zero deforestation commitments are being rolled out more widely now. But I mean, even non-primary forest should fall into that sort of protective net for companies that are signed up to you know, high carbon stocks approach, for example, and have other zero deforestation commitments in place. So the sort of thresholds around what is a forest are pretty low as part of those programs. So it really should shift oil palm cultivation out of anything that even approximates to being a forest, let alone primary forest.
Yeah, if I may just add to what has been said by Glen and Eleanor. The government policy at the moment, which was set by the previous government, is a maximum of 6.5 million hectares under oil palm. We are already at 6 million hectares, slightly above that. So which means another 500,000 hectares you're looking at. This is primarily targeted at Sarawak state, rather than Peninsula or Malaysia, because Sarawak state government had a policy of expanding their oil palm area. But they do have issues in Sarawak because a lot of the land is peat, and under RSPO, peat is a no-go. And even if you are a non-RSPO member, there are constraints and difficulties in developing peat, apart from the economic aspect, because from our analysis shows that if you're going to plant on peat, the cost of development is going to be anything between 25 to 30% more. But what is of interest is that even local banks, the financial institutions today, have already adopted more or less the RSPO principles and criteria when it comes to lending policies. Of course, international banks have their own criteria, that is RSPO++, so it becomes extremely difficult. So to get for a new player on the scene, to get funding for development is not going to be easy. And so I think there will not be any further encroachment into even logged over forest, secondary forest, forget about primary forest, even into those areas, it is going to be difficult. And the other factor is, it's all basically economics at the moment, is the labor shortage in Malaysia. So if you're going to develop new land, where on earth are you going to get your labor from for crop harvesting? As it is both in Sabah and Sarawak, you're close to 85%, 90% are under foreign workers. And you have already heard or read in the reports the issues around foreign workers at the moment. So that's going to be another constraint. So the good news is that I doubt very much whether there will be any further new plantings or any sort of encroachment into not just high conservation value forests or high carbon stock values, even into secondary areas. I doubt it very much.
Okay, thank you for all the answers. We have we're gonna take in one more question. So this is a question from Pin Wong for Eleanor. You mentioned that riparian reserves do not provide ecosystem services or this service. How will you convince your stakeholders to expand their riparian zones?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, so this is something that we've been discussing as part of the RITRI program. So for a lot of the oil palm companies that are signed up to the RSPO has now got its guidelines on riparian areas. And as part of those guidelines on riparian areas, it sort of separates them out. So if you decide that your riparian area is particularly important, for example, for community use, so for fishing or clean water, then it would have a wider riparian zone. Similarly, if there's data that say your riparian area is very important as a corridor for species to move through, for example, elephants or something like this, then your riparian zone might be wider than the legal standard width. So this is something that's already kind of built into the RSPO guidelines. But of course, this would need discussing a lot, particularly for smallholder groups as well. So this is something that, that we've not really looked into, and it's a little bit beyond my remit because I'm a scientist, so I provide the science that says, as a scientist, we would like to expand, or it might be good if you want to increase biodiversity on your estate, that you increase these high conservation value forest areas, or you increase the buffer widths. But the actual sort of implementation of that policy or something, that's something that's for the government to look at how best to do that. Certainly for the big oil palm companies that are under RSPO and whether MSPO takes up similar guidelines is something to discuss. So this would come at the level of sort of the governments and people belonging to those groups. For smallholders, I think this is definitely something where we need to look a bit more at their opinions and how that might affect them, for sure.
Okay, thank you. There are a few more questions, but to keep things on schedule, we'll have to move on to the next talk now. I'll let Eleanor know these questions, and then she will try to answer them later. You can contact her separately. We have to move on now to stick to the schedule. Okay, so thank you, Eleanor. Our next speaker for this session is Dr. Kalsum Yusah. She's a senior lecturer at the Institute for Tropical Biology and Conservation at the University Malaysia of Sabah, also known as UMS. She has been involved with SAFE projects since the beginning. She's been mentoring, supervising, training many Malaysians and international students and our staff as well. So today she's going to be sharing her wealth of experience on people development and collaborations. Over to you, Dr. Kalsum.
Hello, Sway, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
So it's raining intermittently here. So good evening, everyone who's in Malaysia, and good morning to those in the UK. I'm Kalsum from the Institute for Tropical Biology and Conservation here in UMS. This evening, I'll be talking about investing in people and how SAFE has been instrumental in increasing scientific community profile and also capacity building in Malaysia and in Sabah generally. For the first part of the talk, I'll be talking about focusing slightly on the scientific community and also the output from the student alumni, their achievements so far. And out of 140 Malaysians, 45% of this total number is actually students, and followed by 27% of research assistants and 25% of researchers. So this is actually a huge number of SAFE communities. And so far, there's 129 scientific publications that comes out of SAFE, and the majority of these papers are actually co-authored by Malaysian scientists, including students of undergraduates, masters, and PhD, which is actually really, really great for us. And let's have a look at examples of a few of the papers that involve Malaysians. This is one of the highly cited high impact paper that was published in 2014. And this involved nine of local researchers. And then in terms of students' participation, this one looking at plant interactions in oil palm and comparing that with logged forest has been co-authored by one of the undergraduate students. And one of the most prolific researchers on our side is actually Professor Henry, and he has been involved in 29 mammals projects in SAFE and has co-authored astoundingly huge number of publications, so 26. If you are in the publication business, you know that this is a big number for 10 years. So he's only second to Rob, actually, in terms of numbers of paper that comes out of SAFE. Moving on to PhD students, they are all young emerging scientists, which is, I think, ahead of their game with several publications already in their pocket. But I'm just going to highlight to you this very nice looking young gentleman, Dr. Anand Nayanar, who is actually will be facilitating one of our breakout session later on this evening. So Anand PhD has been supported by SAFE, and his study was focusing on effects of logging and conversion to oil palm on stream hydrology and sedimentation rates. And Anand now is a scientist at the University of Tokyo Forest, and now is helping PhD students who's working on the same field in SAFE project. So this is basically training the trainer, if you'd like to think of it in that sense. And Anand has been also busy publishing papers related to the subject, with 2 out of 3 publications is actually first author. So he has been really busy, and we would be really, really looking forward to outputs from Anand in the future. Moving on to master's students, there's a total of 17 students, Malaysian students, that has been doing their project in SAFE. And I did a quick exit survey of what these students are now doing. And overwhelmingly, 88% of them are actually still in the conservation related field. Some of them are still pursuing their studies in Dublin, in Czech Republic, which is really high profile universities. It's really good for us, and NGO, and government conservation agencies, and also in oil palm industry. So these are one of the examples. These 3 lovely ladies here, the one in pink is actually now assistant curator at the Natural History Sabah Museum. She has also been working in SAFE postgraduate after her master's. And the one in the middle is Rani. She is now lecturer and still pursuing her PhD in University Malaysia Kelantan. And the third one is Akila here. She is now research officer at the Center for Research and Innovation in UMS. So all high-flying graduates and alumni of SAFE. However, we've also produced students that are actually now into fighting. So she is now an international mixed martial arts fighter with 2 international wins under her belt. So all is good. And this is just to show you the publications out of master students. 4 out of 5 is actually first authored by these students. Let's move on to research assistants. So far, there's 40 local research assistants trained, and these are all people who are multi-talented in what they do now. And so they have been trained in a lot of different wide ranging of field skills, from trapping invertebrates into big mammals, and into taxa identifications of identifying the littlest ants that's crawling on the floor, into long-term data monitoring and retrieval and storing all of this very important data, dendrology work. The list is endless, and some of them is actually also are qualified professionally in rope access techniques. But most important thing, like the thing that actually makes SAFE stands out of all, their research assistants is actually trained in first aid, which is not so easily that for you to qualify. So if I'm going to the field, I will be very, very happy to go with them, because they know how to save lives. They know how to do CPR. Okay, so, but the thing that you need to focus here is that actually all of these research assistants, they have been, they came from interior parts of Sabah, which is from Pinanga, from Luasong, from Kuamut, Bukit Garam, in Kalabakan. So SAFE has been creating job opportunities to these people, and for the advancement of their career of these research assistants. I'm just going to show you example of one of them, Unding is a wonderful person, and he's a personal friend of mine. He's also a certified canopy access instructor. He can teach you and he can show you how to do this very, very competently. He's also the one who has been responsible for measuring the tallest world tropical trees, which stood at 100.08 meters in Danum Valley. But most important thing of all, Unding has been for the past 8 years helping me teaching this canopy access practical course in UMS. So this course is actually part of this one course, which is called Canopy Biology, the only course that involve proper formal canopy access training into the curriculum of the undergraduates. So far we have nearly 500 graduates, which is now going out and doing their thing in the world, but knowing the wonders of the canopy and the possibilities of what you might find out there. And some of these students are actually have pursued professional science, professional career in rope access. So all of this thanks to Unding. So now for the second part of the talk, the way forward of how we brought all of those achievements and how all of those Malaysian involvements in SAFE, how can we carry on this forward into the next chapter? And how we can use this to expand human capacity and development. So let's have a look at 4 different aspects of this. The first one would be at how we can invest in students. We can actually create or prioritize scholarship and funding for bright underprivileged students from rural areas or children of plantation workers. And we can also create internship opportunities within the industry, not just, you know, like for undergraduate students that we have in local universities or private universities. They are going out to do their internships at the end of the year, but there is no internship for students who is finishing their primary schools or their secondary school and dropping out for whatever reason. Like it could be monetary, it could be family conflict, it could be they are living too far away from the university and can't go into the universities. These are actually big pool of resources that we can use and we can train into and brought into the future. And also we can do skill enhancements within university students by creating field courses targeting specific vocational skills. And other things that we can do would be creating something called School of Nature, or you can call it whatever you like, for primary and secondary students, where we brought students from town into the rural areas or into conservation areas and vice versa. You know, like if you expose little children, primary school children into this realm outside of their comfort zone, this actually have a long-lasting impact on how they look at lives and like their decisions in the future. So I think this is something that we can look into. And thinking slightly outside of the box, we could create curriculum outside of conventional classroom syllabus. For example, I was the coordinator for the internship students for my course at the university, and we've got a few complaints from the industry that says that our graduates is lacking very much in soft skills. So these are the things that we can target and bring into the formal curriculum within the university, but that will be something for us to ponder upon. For the second part, it will be investing in research assistants. For this one, our research assistants, they are all very skilled, but we can actually enhance this more by allowing them and letting them attend formal online courses or available courses at higher education institutions. Or for example, there's this Department of Skills Development under the Human Resources Ministry that allows you to do their courses and give out certificates of level 1, 2, and 3 and diploma for level 4 and 5. And all of these certificates and diplomas are actually acknowledged industries nationwide. So these are the things that they can use and can help them forward in their career. And also we can do something like interagency secondment of research assistance, where exchange of skills and knowledge can be transferred over from, for example, from SAFE project research assistants that know certain sets of skills with those that is in Sabah parks who are very expert in permanent plots in the highland. So they can actually like transfer all of this knowledge, and then the world of the science will be much better, or something like that. You know what I mean? And apart from that, these research assistants, I think they could benefit from internship into the industry of the oil palm or other NGOs from different states. I think slightly talking out of this topic, SERB has been really, really good with this. SERB actually has brought some of the research assistants to international conference and exposing them to the, not just going out into the field and collecting those data, but what do those data mean, and what does it mean to the community, and how do you convey them to the world? So this actually gives more deeper, meaningful to their work. Okay, the third one is investing in local communities. I think this would be the last emphasis, because the last one, Eleanor has been going in depth onto that topic, so I will just touch that briefly. Investing in local communities, I think emphasis should be on the socio-economic and poverty alleviation. In Sabah, I think the most important thing is we have to tackle literacy. It's appalling that in Sabah, literacy rate is actually only at 79%. And before we can talk about conservations of how you can change everything, but people who actually live this life, we have to elevate their socioeconomic status before we can do anything. So literacy is the first thing that I think we should pay attention to. And then after that, we can go into management of conflicts between conservation and local communities and tackling that. For example, the only one that I can think of on top of my head is like human-elephant conflicts. And we can strengthen the Satoyama initiative, which Sabah is part of through the Natural Resources Office from the Chief Minister's Department. And also with this, we can, through the Satoyama initiative, we can actually show them how to be sustainably in collecting forest resources and harvesting activities that they, or the rural people or people who live on the periphery of forest reserves are doing. And comes then rubbish management and composting and all of these things, nature, tourism activities, if they have nature attractions that they can actually highlight, or other things that we can do with them is citizen scientists, where we collaborate with community people and showing them and getting them to give us data, and vice versa, where we can have knowledge exchange between us and the communities. I think I took too long. Anyway, so this is the last part. I think Eleanor has been talking in depth about this, so I will just show you this slide, and that's all from my talk. Thank you to all of these institutions, without which SAFE wouldn't be as great as it is now. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kalsum. So we're only gonna take one question for Dr. Kalsum, because we want to keep to our schedule and we are running a bit slightly over time. It happens. It's all the talks, it's not one talk. Okay, just one question. Probably, this is probably Glen would probably be the right person to answer, or me. Are there any projects in SAFE being led by Sabahans at the moment? Glen, do you want to answer it?
Wait, you're better placed to answer this than me. Go ahead, Sui.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so I should answer it. So I'm Malaysian, so I'm the scientific coordinator for SAFE project. Under me, we have a team of research assistants, all our senior research assistants who handle core research projects are all Sabahans. And aside from that, we are under SERB, all the senior managers are all local Sabahans. So I'm the only non-Sabahan running the project at SAFE, but I'm from Kuala Lumpur, so Malaysian, but yeah. So yeah, just to answer your question, almost all our staff are Sabahan, and people who are in charge of the day-to-day and the research on site are all Sabahan people. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you all for your questions. We will go for a short 10-minute break now. So we will resume in 10 minutes time at 5:40 Malaysian time, and that would be 9:40 UK time. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to our webinar, Science at Safe conference. So now we have 3 more speakers for this webinar session. So next is I would like to introduce Dr. Terhi Riutta. She's a research associate with the University of Oxford and Imperial College London. Terhi has been working at the SAFE project since 2011, studying carbon dynamics in old-growth forests, log forests, and plantation landscapes. Today, she's going to be telling us about how SAFE project has increased our understanding of carbon in tropical forests and plantation landscapes. Okay, over to you, Terhi.
Thank you, Zoe. So, right, I hope I'm sharing. Thank you. So without further ado, I just launch into it because Zoe already introduced me, and most of the people who have been at SAFE have seen me there at some point. So why would we study carbon? So intact forests in Southeast Asia have most of the most majestic, most carbon-dense tropical forests in the world. But at the same time, that region is a hotspot of emissions from forest degradation and deforestation. And because locked and degraded forests now cover a larger area proportion intact forests in the tropics globally, but our data is still skewed towards intact forests. This lack of data from human-modified landscapes actually limits our understanding of the carbon budget of the tropical forests at the biome level. So I will briefly introduce the carbon-related projects at SAFE. I will start with the oldest, so that's the so-called SAFE core project, which has been funded by Sime Darby from the start of the SAFE project in 2010. So first we have a flux tower in locked forest landscape that is measuring the CO2 exchange between the ecosystem and the atmosphere continuously. Then we have 10 intensive 1 hectare carbon plots covering oak grove forests, locked forests, and oil palm plantation. And to complement those, there are numerous smaller vegetation plots in the landscape, which don't have as intensive measurements, but they have a better landscape level coverage. So in addition to the SAFE core data, between 2014 and 2019, there was a large human-modified tropical forest program funded by the UK's Natural Environment Research Council. These projects were called Bali and Lombok, and you have already seen some of the data in the previous talks. And these projects were not only looking at carbon dynamics, but also biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, but they did provide a lot of data on carbon dynamics as well. Then there have been numerous smaller projects. So I did search on the SAFE website. Sorry, I'm trying to get my pointer. So I used carbon as a search term in the project database, and it resulted in 42 records of research projects that mention carbon. So we really have been putting quite a lot of effort into trying to understand carbon dynamics at SAFE. So obviously I will not be able to cover all of these projects and all the data that we produced, because I counted that there has been something like 40 publications that are related to carbon dynamics, but I will just give you an overview and show you some results. So when we talk about carbon dynamics, we can divide them into stocks and fluxes. So the carbon stocks, or pools as they are also called, are in living biomass, in dead wood mass, and in the soil. And then we have the flows between these various pools, and we call them fluxes, and also the flows of carbon between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. So first, if we look at something that we learned about carbon stocks. So monitoring our biomass using LiDAR is a state-of-the-art method for estimating biomass at the landscape scale. So basically, a plane flies over the landscape and it sweeps the surface with a laser. And then this will give us a 3D representation of the forest structure. And then we can combine the LiDAR data, which tells us mainly about canopy height, with our ground-based estimates of the biomass, and then we can establish the relationship between them. And by combination of the ground-based data, which is limited to the smaller plots, and the LiDAR data that covers the whole landscape, we can then estimate a landscape level biomass. So at SAFE, we've been quite lucky because we haven't had not only one, but 2 LiDAR flights over the landscape to give us detailed information about the biomass and forest structure. So the first LiDAR flight in 2014 was part of the Bali project, so that was really part of SAFE. And the second LiDAR flight wasn't actually part of SAFE project, but it did fly over the area, and the SAFE researchers collaborated in the data processing. And that second flight resulted in a biomass map for the whole of Sabah. And of course, LiDAR can also be used for estimating biomass in oil palm plantations as well as forest. So this paper is the first one to use LiDAR data to map above-ground carbon biomass in oil palm plantations of different ages. And the authors also developed a method to automatically segment and count individual oil palm crowns. And this is just an example how we can get a lot more information from LiDAR, not just biomass. So this is showing the difference in the vertical structure of the canopy between an old growth plot in Malayao and a heavily logged plot at SAFE. And we can see how the crown volume, the profile is different, and also the area where you have the maximum amount of leaves is different between the different forest types. And LiDAR can also not only be used for those who are interested in carbon and forest structure, but also those who are interested in ecosystem function and biodiversity. So here's a couple of papers that have been using the LiDAR data to predict and model the forest microclimate, the abundance of mammals, and also the occurrence of leeches. And in addition to airborne LiDAR that we use from a plane, we can also use terrestrial LiDAR to map trees from the ground. And obviously with this terrestrial LiDAR, we cannot cover such vast areas, but we can actually get really detailed information of the structure and architecture of individual trees. So this is the tallest tropical tree that Kalsum already mentioned in her talk. And I'm glad she acknowledged Unding, who actually climbed this tree. So during the LiDAR flight, some really tall trees were spotted that were sticking out of the forest canopy. And then these tall trees were verified with ground visits. And this individual, which is Shorea fakitiana, and it was named Menara, is, to our best knowledge, the tallest tropical tree anywhere in the world, measuring just over 100 meters. And here on the right, we can see how the terrestrial LiDAR scan can give us a really detailed information of the shape and the size of this tree. And so I've been talking about living biomass, but we have also biomass in deadwood. And it can be a really significant component in a disturbed site. So this is a disturbance gradient from no disturbance to really heavily disturbed forest. And we can see that in heavily disturbed forest, over 60% of the biomass can be in deadwood. So then moving on from the stocks to fluxes. So our main carbon fluxes is photosynthesis or cross-plant productivity. And about 60% or 2/3 of that is used for the plant's own metabolism, so released as autotrophic respiration. And the remaining third is used as net primary productivity, so in other words, the production of new tissue. And we also have carbon released through heterotrophic respiration, from soil and from dead plant remains. And these heterotrophic and autotrophic respirations sum up as ecosystem respiration. And when we want to calculate the forest carbon balance, we just subtract ecosystem respiration from cross-parent productivity. So this is data from the SAFE Flux Tower over locked forest landscape. This is a daily time series, or a small part of it. And we can see that during most days, the system is the net source of CO2 to the atmosphere, and occasionally a sink. We can then estimate based on that the annual balance. This is the flux tower-based measurement, and this is a plot-based measurements, and both of them indicate that the locked forest is a net carbon source to the atmosphere, and old-growth forest is carbon neutral. We can use data from the plots to break this into components. So in this graph, we have a difference, so this is locked minus old growth. So positive values indicate that the flux is larger in locked forest. And we can see that there is no difference in gross and net parent productivity. But in locked forest, woody productivity is higher, which is in accordance with those studies that show biomass rapid biomass recovery on locked forests. So if total productivity is similar, but woody productivity is higher, then there must be some kind of allocation shift. And that is indeed the case. So in old growth forest, 42% of the productivity is allocated to woody tissue and 47% to canopy. Whereas in locked forest, we got 64% allocated to woody tissue and only 24% to canopy. So there is this shift from canopy towards woody component following logging. And then if we go back to this graph, we can see that ecosystem respiration is higher in locked forest, and that is due to higher heterotrophic respiration, while there is no difference in autotrophic respiration. So this seems to be the biggest difference, like determining why locked forest would be a net carbon source. So we wanted to understand the heterotrophic respiration a little bit better. So in order to do that, we constructed this detailed soil carbon budget using our empirical data. So we quantified the inputs into soil from canopy, from coarse roots, and from fine roots, and then the release of carbon from soil as soil respiration from the soil organic matter and from these various pools. And then we could see whether the inputs into the soil were in balance with the respiration from the soil. And we could see that in old growth forest, this was indeed the case. So the mean of the distribution is very close to zero, but in locked forest, this calculation resulted in negative values. So in most cases, locked forest soils, they're losing carbon. There has also been quite a lot of work in soil microbial communities and their function. And this is something that is not my area, so I just mentioned that there's a lot that has been done. And what seems to stand out is that the oil palm microbial communities are different, and the productivity of fungal hyphae is smaller in oil palm than in old growth or locked forests. And also we need to remember that CO2 is not the only flux from the soil that we need to think about. If we want to get a greenhouse gas budget, we also need to quantify nitrous oxide and methane fluxes, which was done as part of the Lombok forests. And it shows very high variability in nitrous oxide fluxes, especially in riparian reserves. And it shows also that oil palm plantation soils are a methane sink, while riparian reserves and locked forest soils are either small methane sources or neutral. And one last thing, because I think I'm running over, is that we are not operating in isolation. So in addition to providing information about SAFE and SABA, these data have been used in global analysis. I'm just highlighting two. This is looking at how productivity responds to vapor pressure deficit. This is a pantropical analysis, and our Malaysian plots are somewhere here in the humid end of the gradient. And this is a pantropical analysis mapping leaf traits that are measured on the ground, and then but coming up with these pantropical maps using high resolution satellite data. And here is our Malaysian plots contributing to that data set. So what have we learned? We have learned a lot about structure and traits and function, and above ground biomass estimates and provided first estimates of the complete carbon cycle in locked tropical forests. But what are some of the things that we don't know? We still treat soil as a bit of a black box. We don't have such good understanding of the soil processes. We don't know how long locked forests will persist as carbon sources and how long it will take for the biomass stocks to recover. And if the nutrient loss during logging is significant, and does this limit the sustainability of repeated rounds of logging? And also how well we can apply the results from SAFE to the wider landscape. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Terhi. Questions? No? Okay, we have a question here from Chuan Chek Chong. May I know which fungi literature you used in your presentation?
Oh, I have to say, I do not know, but I'm very happy to put citation to those studies on the chat if that will help. So then, because that is outside my expertise, that is done by my colleagues. But I provide the information in the chat in a little bit.
Okay, thank you for your question, and thank you, Terhi, for the answer. Okay, I guess. Okay, so thank you, Terhi. We will move on to our next talk now. Next up, we have Professor Rob Ewers of Imperial College of London. He's a co-founder of SAFE project and the science director of the project. His research focuses on tropical deforestation and ecosystem impacts. Today, he's going to be talking about the development of technology for research at SAFE. Over to you, Rob.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sui. I would like to start by thanking Sime Darby Foundation for their amazing support over the past 10 years, which has made all of this possible, really. One of the things we've been doing is putting SAFE on the forefront of developing new technology to understand and monitor the environment, almost since the day the project began. We've been doing this in 3 ways. We've been early adopters of key technologies that already existed. We've gotten ourselves involved as a test bed for trialing out emerging technologies, and we've tackled the development of new technology ourselves. In this talk, I want to give you some of the examples of what we've been doing. We heard about some LiDAR work from Terhi that involved aeroplanes, but there's easier ways to get into the air, and UAVs or drones are really popular at the moment. But a lot of people don't really know why, apart from the fact that they're very cool toys to have. Well, we've been trialing and developing methods to use them for getting 2 types of information. The first is to find animals, so in particular orangutans. So we had a master's student, Joe Sullivan, who used an infrared camera and flew the drone at night. And it does work. He picked up images of orangutans. He picked up images of himself and also other animals like macaques sleeping in the top of trees. So it does work. But to be honest, it didn't work particularly well. This was an encouraging first step, but our detection rates were still really quite low. So we're hoping to do follow-up studies on this. So for example, in this pilot study, Joe was flying really high because we were scared of crashing our expensive drone into the trees. And he had a camera pointing straight down. So the next steps are to try and see more clearly beneath the canopy. So flying lower, pointing the camera at a more oblique angle. A second use of UAVs is to monitor forest phenology. So when trees flush new leaves or go into flowering and fruiting stages. And it's probably one of the most powerful drivers of animal movement within a forest, but it's also one of the most challenging to monitor because in the tropics, every tree does its own thing at its own time. So Ross Gray is another of SAFE's PhD students. He's developed a world-first system for doing this automatically. He's been taking aerial photos every 3 or 4 days and used them to map out the location of individual tree crowns. And for each tree crown, he's been using artificial intelligence algorithms to detect any color changes. And these color changes tell us that something's happening, that there's a phenological event going on. And Ross's AI has proven remarkably effective at detecting these events. It's just as accurate as walking around the forest and doing the survey manually, but doing it this way will ultimately let us monitor hundreds and even thousands of hectares at a time. And we're now hoping to extend this approach into mapping of oil palm plantations, because we think we can start automating the process of monitoring palm growth rates and possibly also detect some of the nutrient deficiencies and diseases that cause colour changes to palm fronds. Very closely related to LiDAR technology that Terhi mentioned are the new hydrology sensors we've installed and are trialling. These were developed by colleagues at Imperial to be a cheap alternative for monitoring water level. They're desperately needed because the streams at Safe change water level a whole lot, as these photos show. The floods routinely wiped out our very expensive sensors that we were placing under the water, and even concreting them in place wasn't enough to hold them there through some of the floods. So we had a master's student, Bree Roxby, who got involved in field testing these new devices that hang above the river, and they send a laser pulse down, record how far it is down to the water level, and it does this continuously. So it's starting to give us incredibly accurate and incredibly detailed data on stream flows and water discharge rates. We've done quite a bit of work in these small headwater streams at Safe, and one of our long-lasting interests has been to monitor their biodiversity. eDNA, or environmental DNA, is an emerging technique to do this. It's sequencing DNA collected from the environment. It's potentially an extremely powerful way of figuring out what species are out there. And our first trial of this emerging technology was by Harry Layfield, another master's student. He sequenced water from the streams, and it proved remarkably effective at detecting otters. So if otters had been in the water upstream of our water sample, then we could pretty accurately detect them just by sequencing the water. And so we're now planning to roll out trials of this for monitoring fish and frogs as well. eDNA is much harder to do for things like mammals though, because they're on land rather than in the water. So one of Safe's PhD students, Rosie Drinkwater, tackled this by sequencing the DNA inside the bodies of leeches instead. So leeches feed on mammals, but leeches are a lot easier to find and catch than mammals. So potentially we can get a shortcut to understanding the mammal communities by looking at leeches. The Rosie sequenced over 500 leeches, which had sucked blood from 15 taxa of mammals. And it was enough data to give us pretty reliable information about differences in mammal communities in different parts of the forest. And it pulled out data on species like the Sunda pangolin, which is a rare species, though it's very uncommon that we see it using our more traditional methods for surveying mammals. So this is a really encouraging technology, and one we think is worth expanding on. One of our most exciting and most powerful technology developments has been in using audio, so the sound of the environment. Sarab Sethi, a PhD student at Safe, has developed a new acoustic sensor, solar powered. It sits in the forest canopy, it connects to the mobile network, and it continuously records and sends acoustic data to the internet, where we pick it up and use it for analysis. Sarab won a very prestigious United Nations Technology Prize for this new device, and it's now in the early stages of being commercialized as well. We've taken advantage of it to set up an online radio station, so you can tune in, listen to the forest anytime you like. But having the sound itself doesn't tell you anything of value unless you're able to interpret that sound. So we've been working hard on applying machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms to unravel what acoustic data has to tell us. And it tells us a lot. It's been remarkably successful, in fact. So for example, another master's student led the development of an algorithm that automatically detects gibbons from their calls, which is going to let us automatically monitor their activity through time. But even more exciting, I think, is that we can tell what condition a forest is in now just by listening to it. That opens the door for using acoustics to monitor the sustainability of habitats, including things like high conservation values areas and plantations. This is going to be cheaper and quite possibly more accurate way of measuring environmental sustainability than doing it through manual biodiversity surveys. And at the same time, we can use that exact same monitoring tool as an early warning system. SARAB developed an algorithm that listens to your site and warns you if there's any strange noises showing up. The strange sounds are going to be one of the very first earliest signals that something might be wrong in your environment. So it could be guns, it could be chainsaws, but it could even be much more innocuous things like human voices where humans shouldn't be present. So SARAB's system automatically detects what we call anomalous sounds, and it can do that in real time. So it means within minutes of a strange noise being heard, we can get an alert out to the appropriate person so they can get into the field and check the problem. So this has a huge amount of potential for protecting natural habitats because it's like a burglar alarm for the environment. It'll raise alarms before significant damage is done to the habitat and give us a chance to stop it. Now, this final bit of technology might seem boring, but databasing ecological data is really, really hard. David Orme was given the challenge of cracking this problem to make all of SAFE's data searchable and accessible and transparent online. He's done an amazing job on this. He's even automated the process of checking that data to ensure there's no obvious typos or other little formatting mistakes hidden inside it. David wrote a statistics package that can directly import these data for analysis. And yes, I know we all know this sounds boring, but boy, is it important technology to have, not just to us, but to anyone monitoring the environment. Rigorous data management is fundamental to knowing if your environment is sustainable or whether it's changing. And our database solution can help with that. So I'd like to finish by quickly thanking our many funders, supporters and collaborators that have contributed to this work, and of course particularly the Sime Darby Foundation for their central support of SAFE over the last 10 years. That was a very brief whistle-stop tour of the technologies we've been developing, testing and deploying. SAFE has been at the front edge of a lot of exciting new developments, and we've got a great track record of training students in the use of these new technologies. Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to me, and please do let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Okay. Questions, anybody? Let's see, did anybody raise their hand? Okay, no questions, so we can move on to the next talk. If anyone later oh wait, there is a question now from Miss Caroline Russell. Have you used new acoustic technology? Okay, let me rephrase this. Has acoustic technology been used to help anti-poaching?
Hi, Caroline. We haven't deployed it in the field in live situations yet, but we're working towards that really fast at the moment. We have some more software development going on, but we're pretty confident that it should work. So we know we can detect strange sounds and we don't need to define it in advance. So one of the problems acoustic technology has often run into is, for example, you train an algorithm to detect a gunshot, but it only detects one type of gunshot. And if you use a different gun, it doesn't work. Or it doesn't catch the sound of a machete chopping a tree or something. So something SARAB's done is make an algorithm that detects anything which just sounds different to what we've heard at this site before. So it should pick up a lot of the signals of poachers at a site, including things like vehicles coming in, people talking, moving through the forest. So we're really looking forward to getting this deployed and trialed in real life situations. And there's no obvious reason why it shouldn't work. And the software to make it possible is on its way.
Well, just really on behalf of Yayasan Sime Darby, if there was an opportunity for us to explore that, I think, because we're working in Peninsula in the Royal Balloon, setting up anti-poaching teams, but, it's the coverage that becomes such a problem. So perhaps if you're looking for some trialing, there's an opportunity for further collaboration there.
That would be great. We'll definitely be looking for sites.
Okay, next question from Alex Shankin. What are the principal challenges in developing audio monitoring into a truly robust biodiversity monitoring tool?
That's a good question. Biodiversity itself is desperately difficult to monitor however you do it. Audio has great advantages that it captures such a wide set of species. You've got frogs that make noise and insects and mammals and birds all coming together. But pulling those apart to actually count the number of species making that noise is a desperately difficult challenge. What we can do and have done is show that we can correlate just the broad scale metrics of acoustics. We can correlate those very closely with the number of species that we've observed in point counts, for example, watching what we're seeing in the forest at the same time as recording the audio. And again, this is pretty effective. So we have been reasonably successful at doing this, which means probably it's going to work quite well in other forests in Sabah. But of course, once you go into different forest types with different species, then you need to go through that calibration step again. So if you're going to take this into Peninsular Malaysia, for example, or across into some of the Indonesian regions, then you're going to have to do more site-specific calibrations to start getting it to work. But it is feasible.
Okay, our last question for Rob is from Miguel Falchi. I wonder what would be the ideal range of acoustic sensors?
Yeah, as sensitive as you can. Obviously, louder noises travel further. You're never going to completely monitor every part of a habitat that you want to protect. And so the question is really one of where you put your acoustic sensors to have the most impact or the most benefit. And that we don't know the answer to that yet, which is one of the reasons we need to get out and do some trials, but it's going to be something around access points. So where are your threats going to come from? Now, we're not going to put it right at the edge of an HCV area in oil palm plantation, because you get too much noise from plantation workers who should be there and trucks going past who should be there. So we want to be out of the range of the day-to-day sounds, those sorts of disturbances, acoustic disturbances, but close enough to the edge that we have a pretty good chance of picking up anyone who's using that road as a beachhead to get into the forest itself.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Okay, moving on to our last speaker of this webinar series is Dr. Louise Ashton. She's an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. Her research focuses on tropical forest biodiversity and responses to environmental changes. Today, she's going to be helping us answer a question: can biodiversity persist in human-modified tropical landscapes, such as the SAFE project area? Over to you, Dr. Louise.
Thanks, Suri. Can you hear me okay, and is my screen shared?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. So yeah, today I'll be talking about some results from the SAFE project on ecosystem resilience. And I mostly study invertebrates, but I'm going to try and summarize results from a broad range of groups. So first off, what is resilience? It's the ability of an ecosystem to bounce back after some kind of environmental pressure or change. So something like logging, fishing, pollution, any ability of the ecosystem to absorb that pressure and recover it back to normal function. Different types of ecosystems will have different levels of resilience. So here are some theoretical ecosystems, and the red line represents some kind of environmental pressure like overfishing. And you can see here on the left, this ecosystem is quite resilient and it recovers from that pressure quite well. In the middle, this ecosystem is more heavily impacted by that pressure, but it bounces back very quickly, and so it has still got that resilience built in. Over here on the right, this ecosystem is very heavily impacted by this impact, and it takes a long time to recover, so it has lower resilience to that impact. So what gives these ecosystems resilience, and why are some more resilient than others? There are lots of different ideas to explain this, to try and answer these questions. And one of them has been the diversity stability hypothesis, which basically says that the more species you have, the more resilient and stable the ecosystem will be. And there have been some different explanations as to why that might be. One of them is that if you have a big range of different species, some of them will respond to that disturbance in different ways, and some will be more robust and able to handle that disturbance. Another related idea is functional redundancy, where there are several species that are carrying out similar ecological roles. So if there is some kind of disturbance and some particular species are lost from an ecosystem, if there are other species carrying out similar roles, they can just continue to perform that function, and the ecosystem should still have those processes going. So ecological resilience can be seen as a type of insurance policy to ensure that ecosystems can continue to function after some environmental pressure. Tropical forests are what we've been talking a lot about today, and they're famously very diverse. But how resilient are these tropical forests to change, and how much pressure can they handle and still bounce back? There have been many studies as part of the SAFE project that have investigated these questions, and I'm going to do my best to summarize just a few of them, looking at how forests are resilient to the process of logging. So, starting off, I'll just cover a few studies that have looked at how biodiversity responds to logging, looking at a few different taxonomic groups. So for beetles, Sharp et al. Looked at a group of weevils, and they found that the total number of weevil species in particular areas of logged forest was lower, the diversity was lower, but at the landscape level, at larger areas, the diversity of those groups was maintained in the logged forest. For freshwater fish, Wilkinson et al. Studied the biomass and species composition, and they found that it was resilient to logging, but the diversity of freshwater fish does decline. Looking at mammals, Wen et al. Studied mammals, and they found that some mammals actually can increase in abundance in the logged forest, and this was mostly driven by small mammals increasing. In that paper, they pointed out that this was in a landscape with not very much illegal hunting, and this result may be different when the combination of logging and hunting are putting pressure on these groups. So already we're seeing that there are different taxonomic groups responding in different ways to logging, and it may be a complex response to a number of different factors. For soil fungi, Robinson et al. Showed that productivity and community structure was quite resilient and did not change much when the forest was selectively logged. And for tree diversity, of course, the diversity of trees will be lower when some trees are removed during logging. But this result from Pillay et al. Was quite important because they showed that the ability of seedlings to germinate and survive in the logged forest declines when that forest is intensively logged, and that can have really important implications for how those logged forests can bounce back. So if the ability for the seedlings to germinate declines, in the future those new forests, the logged forests, may have a different number of species in them. So far, I've just touched on some different biodiversity results looking at logging, but what about the processes of ecosystems? How do they respond to logging? And by that, I mean the kind of actions, both biological and physical, that make the system work. These include things like primary production of plants, nutrient turnover, and climate regulation. And in a big paper by Ewers et al., they looked at a number of different ecosystem processes in the safe landscape. And they showed that seed dispersal, which is a really important process for forest regeneration, was actually slightly higher in the logged forest than in the primary forest. And they found that this was because in the primary forest, invertebrates were carrying out most of that seed dispersal, but in the logged forest, vertebrates were becoming more important in that process. So you have a kind of functional redundancy occurring where the process is still happening, but different groups are carrying that process out. They also looked at nutrient turnover and found that decomposition of leaf litter was similar in the logged and unlogged forests. And they looked at predation, which is an important process for maintaining herbivory and allowing plants to grow. And again, they found that the predation of the herbivores was about the same between the logged and unlogged forests. Bioturbation is another important process. It's basically the movement of soil by soil organisms. And it's important for things like microbial activity, decomposition, water infiltration through the soil, and soil quality. And this paper by Tuma et al., they showed along the safe gradient that when you are looking at the overall rates of bioturbation, how much soil is being moved, there is actually quite similar rates of bioturbation between the primary and logged forests. But when you look at the logged forest, that process is being driven only by two very common species of termites. So we're shifting that function to reliance on just two species to deliver that important process. And that may make these systems more vulnerable to further environmental pressures. So some authors think that there may be some loss of this biodiversity and the insurance policy that those ecosystems have. So far, I've only really talked about resilience to logging, but it's nearly 2021 and we have to think about all of the multiple pressures that our modern landscapes are under. And these ecosystems will be subject to a combination of pressures. So logging will be combined with things like drought impacts, and these may push the ecosystems beyond their ability to bounce back. So this is an example of this was from Chiu et al., who showed that logging intensity changes the level of seedling mortality during a drought. And that could again reduce the ability for those forests to bounce back. So going forward, moving forward, we need to understand how multiple stresses will interact to affect these ecosystems. We need to plan ahead for what will happen under things like future climate change. So these are some models for the safe area to look at what will happen under future climate change. And these models show that rainfall seasonality will increase. And that means that the wet months will become wetter and the dry months will become drier, according to those models. Biodiversity is quite resilient to logging in some ways, but perhaps biodiversity might also provide some resilience to these other pressures as well. So I was involved in a study of termites, and we were looking at the roles of termites only in the primary forest. And we happened to set up that experiment at the beginning of that 2015 El Nino drought. And we found that during the drought, the number of termites actually doubled. They were really increased a lot during that drought. And in the presence of termites, a number of key ecosystem processes like decomposition, soil nutrient heterogeneity, and even seedling survival increased in the presence of termites. So we think from these results that termites were mitigating the effects of drought in the primary forest. But these results were only for unlogged forest, and we don't know how these buffering effects are changed when the forest is logged or in other types of ecosystems in the landscape. So this was a brief overview of some of the SAFE studies looking at resilience. And they've shown that modified landscapes can be resilient to this environmental change, but the degree to which biodiversity and the processes are resilient is quite variable. And we need to understand the multiple interacting pressures across these different ecosystem types in the tropical landscapes in order to plan and manage for resilient landscapes so that they can continue to function in the future. So thank you very much for listening. This is a really broad topic and I've tried to cover a lot of different areas. I can answer questions mostly about the resilience and insect stuff. There are other members in the chat are authors in these papers, and we can also talk about particular results in the breakout groups as well. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Louise, for the talk. Okay, questions? Any questions? Okay, Mom. No, let me just do a last check. Any questions? Nope, no questions. Anything else? If you have questions later, you can always we can always proceed with the talk about it in the next session. Thank you. Okay, so thank you all speakers today for the engaging and insightful talks. So we heard about how, just a brief recap, we heard about how research at SAFE has improved our understanding of plantation landscapes, carbon cycling, how we have developed new technology in the field, and how biodiversity and ecosystems are coping in modified tropical landscapes. We also learned about how our scientific outputs at SAFE has actually contributed to better policies in Sabah, and how the SAFE project has laid a very strong foundation in developing and training local talents. So there is still lots of potential to explore to further improve our linkage of our science output to better policies, bridging that gap, and also working on more on capacity building. So for participants, speakers, and our distinguished guests, I hope it's been an interesting and informative webinar for all of you. Thank you for joining us for this session. We will be moving to having a short break now of about 15 minutes. And we'll see you at the next session, which is our breakout group meeting. So see you in about 15 minutes time. That would be at, let's see, 6:45. That would be 10:45 a.m. UK time. So just a recap for those, for everyone, you have to leave this webinar series now and click on the other link in your invite meeting to join our breakout group. And the topics for our breakout group are hydrology, disease ecology, biodiversity, conservation and forest restoration, can talk about skills gaps, and carbon. So you can also move between breakout groups if you have the latest version of Zoom. So see you in 15 minutes time.